Earlier today, The Witcher 3 got yet another new update. This was the anticipated update for the next-gen version of the game. It was hoped this would start to fix some of the lingering performance issues, most notably for PC players, but then also just some of the general bugs that have been around with the next-gen update. The update was about 4 GB on PC and even on PS5, but for some reason 10 to 20 GB on Xbox. It isn't entirely clear why the update was so much bigger on Xbox compared to PlayStation 5, but in general this is due to how file patching works on consoles. And overall, this update is a bit of a weird one. It didn't have the longest patch notes in the world, but there was a nice mix of bug fixes, performance and stability improvements, but also, most exciting, some new features, in particular around quality features that should boost your performance. And there are even some hidden changes that were added with this update that people are already finding. The big change for PC users is there's an addition of a new performance mode for ray tracing. So now, when turning on ray traced global illumination, there is an option for either a quality mode or a performance mode. This performance mode is new. In the old version of the game, you basically only had the quality mode. And basically, this new performance mode will give you slightly worse ray tracing in exchange for slightly more FPS, or at least hopefully. And that all sounds great, but how does it actually feel in game? I created my own little benchmarks in game to test all of the new settings. The old version of the game versus the new version, but then also what kind of differences we see with the performance mode. And what I found was nothing. I spent like an hour and a half testing all of this, and I did find some pretty interesting and really just curious results. First, I just did an apples to apples comparison, the old version of the game versus the new one with the quality mode, so effectively these should be pretty similar. And I had DLSS 2.0 on for each of them, but not DLSS 3.0. And as you can see with the new update, the FPS is basically identical. I ran this test in multiple different scenarios, and although you might notice some slight differences from scene to scene, the general takeaway is that the FPS was exactly the same. But that isn't exactly shocking, as it seems like the real new feature is performance mode. So how did that impact things? Well, this was far more no, just kidding. It was actually almost exactly the same. The performance mode may get you a couple of FPS, and I mean that quite literally, like 2 FPS from time to time, but the vast majority of the time, the performance was exactly the same as the quality mode. You had very little bonuses here. And even just compared to the 4.0 version of the game before this latest update, there's still very little bonus from this new performance mode. One of the things I did notice that did happen in the city scene is things did feel somewhat smoother overall, but again, this is really minor. This was like a momentary FPS drop that I didn't get with performance mode, as well as when I did turn on DLSS 3.0, which is frame generation, which is exclusive to 4000 series GPUs. I feel like on the new build of the game, I actually noticed slightly lower FPS with this new performance mode. But again, this was very minor and it could have just been down to testing variability. And even just in general on patch 4.1, here's a side-by-side comparison of the new ray tracing quality mode versus the performance mode. Notice how I conveniently did not put any labels over which is which. Take the scene in, the beautiful landscape, Roach dutifully trotting forward. Can you tell which is quality mode and which is performance mode? Technically, there should be both benefits to my FPS, but also slightly worse ray tracing quality, so can you see it? Well, I'm guessing you can't tell the difference because there is basically no difference here. Even putting the labels back on and actually going through this several times on my own, the FPS is incredibly close as you walk through this little scene I set up. I could freeze the frame a few times where I get like 3 or 4 more FPS on performance mode, but similar to what I experienced a bit earlier in this video, this is just for a moment. It's like I had bonus FPS for literally less than a second, and then it would snap back to roughly being the same performance. So this performance mode doesn't actually give you much of an upgrade in your performance, but does it have a real visual degradation? Does the game look notably worse on performance mode compared to quality mode? You could definitely notice some changes. Some of the distant shadows are definitely different. You can see on the right side of this image near the water, these little huts on the side of the water will cast shadows on quality mode, where in performance mode there really isn't much there. It's basically no shadowing at all. And even just deeper on this path, you can see more extreme and well-drawn shadows when on the quality mode compared to performance mode, that shadowing being from the trees overhead, but again, it's really minor. So doing this side-by-side comparison, I could definitely start to notice some of the differences between quality and performance mode, but as you're actually playing the game, running around, getting into combat, I think these changes would be near impossible to actually recognize, which makes sense because there's next to no performance change when using these two new modes. Although that isn't all, because if you aren't playing with ray tracing, you may actually notice an FPS drop with this update. And no, that isn't a joke. Reportedly, in the previous version of The Witcher 3 Next Gen, screen space reflections were not working properly. This according to CDPR and their own patch notes. And screen space reflections are basically going to be an alternate to ray tracing. So if you had ray tracing off, you likely had screen space reflections on. And now with patch 4.1, screen space reflections are working once again, which as a result, you may notice slightly lower FPS if you have the exact same settings on with this new update. The game likely does look at least slightly better as a result of having these enabled, but of course also at the cost of FPS. So if with this update you're noticing lower FPS, you could try configuring the screen space reflections or even just turning them to a lower setting and you may be back to your old FPS relatively quickly. So on the PC side, things are definitely a bit grim with this update, but on the console side, there definitely are more positives. Screen space reflections on consoles look notably better with this update. CDPR described how they had improved visuals, and some of the early screenshots being posted online, you could definitely tell. But even further, reportedly there are upgrades to performance on console ray tracing mode, so if you are playing on console with ray tracing mode on, you should get slightly more FPS overall. This update also came with a variety of bug fixes. There was an issue where consoles were creating more save games than they were supposed to that was addressed. A bunch of quest-related progress issues, most notably on the battle preparations quest. So now you're able to properly progress that quest, as well as there are actually some hidden changes. In the past version of the game on PC, there was a problem where sometimes if you loaded a save, your performance would just decrease. Like literally just click the load save button and you would have less FPS. You would have to restart the game to get the appropriate amount of FPS. It seems like that was largely fixed with this update, or at least I could not recreate that anymore. But also a pretty big one for console users is there's now the option to turn off vignetting if you don't want this on, which is actually pretty huge. So overall, I think this update's a bit of an odd one. There aren't many performance improvements on PC. Some people are reporting a couple of FPS. I didn't really notice that with my own testing, but obviously everyone's PC, everyone's system's going to be a bit different. And there are a lot of other issues that are still there. Like, I mean, just look at the background as I'm playing or attempting to play the game. This looks rough. There's definitely a lot of room for improvement here. And there are other things that are still plaguing the game, like stutters on PC, autosave lag. And you probably noticed during some of those benchmarks I showed you earlier, my CPU and GPU utilization still remains pretty low, despite my FPS also being low. And I think one of the issues with this update was, since we had a larger gap between the last one, it was kind of expected for this to be a bit of a larger one. But for me, at least on a 4090, there is next to no performance difference, which is kind of crazy considering they literally added in a performance mode. And although for this video, I'm largely talking about my own experience, after reading quite a bit online, it seems like this is just kind of what's applying to everyone. Nobody's getting a huge FPS boost from this update, at least as far as I can tell. But if you did get a huge FPS boost on PC or even on consoles, let me know in the comments down below. It seems like consoles actually did get quite a few nice improvements from this update, but PC remains largely the same.
I was in the middle of a round of Gwent when the vampires